Sagoli Swagwake. Hello, everyone. Yawanko, thank you for joining us today. My name is Louise Padron. I'm an Oneida citizen and an advocate with the Oneida Domestic Abuse and Prevention Program. I'm joined here today by my coworker, Cassie. I'll let her introduce herself.
Thank you, Louise. Hi, everyone. My name is Cassie Cooney, and I am a women's advocate alongside Louise at our Oneida Nation Domestic Abuse Program.
Thanks, Cassie. So the Oneida Nation's Domestic Abuse and Prevention Program is under Oneida Family Services, who has been doing a series of educational events this month to raise awareness for strengthening families. April is also Sexual Assault Awareness and Prevention Month, and so we wanted to provide some important information on the dynamics of sexual abuse, especially in Indigenous communities. Because this is a very sensitive topic, we encourage viewers to take care of yourself as you watch and listen. Please take a break and reach out for help if you need support. But before we get started, I wanted to give a special thank you to local Oneida artist, Maya Wallenfang, for designing our background that we're using today. And without further ado, I will share our slides. In overview of sexual abuse, it's important to understand that sexual abuse affects men, women, children, and two-spirited individuals. Sexual assault is often, but not always, co-occurring with other dynamics and adversities such as substance abuse, domestic violence, missing and murdered Indigenous women, and sex trafficking. Sexual abuse can affect families regardless of race, religion, or socioeconomic status. Statistically, First Nations women are victimized at much higher rates. For example, 1 in 3 Indigenous women are victims of sexual assault, which is 2.5 times the national average. MMIW, sexual assault, and domestic violence are often intersectional issues that impact entire communities and our children. We wanted to offer a historical perspective on sexual assault, especially the unique dynamics within Indigenous communities. It's important to note that before European contact, many of our cultures were matrilineal. Women were honored as life givers and respected leaders in our communities, meaning that dynamics like sexual assault, child abuse, or domestic violence were nearly unheard of. When Europeans came, though, they brought with them ideas of male superiority, and with that, ideas of female inferiority. The strength that the women of our communities presented caused them to be unfairly labeled with names such as wild or savage. And this led to the belief by many European men that Indigenous women should be tamed. And in doing so, it gave European men a sense of accomplishment, which unfortunately led to fetishization of many Native women. As I previously mentioned, sexual assault has been impacting Indigenous communities since first European contact. As colonization and settlements grew and relocation began, many soldiers would camp outside of our villages and starve the communities by preventing access to their natural food resources. Once our women were starved, those soldiers would coerce sexual favors in exchange for food. Historically, we also know that there were high rates of sexual abuse among the boarding schools that many of our ancestors were forced to attend. With that, understandably, many of our community members suffered tremendous traumas. And at the time, and for many years, substance use was the only available way to cope. And while we know that that's not healthy, we also, unfortunately, many of our communities created a normalization of secrecy. And so those, among other dynamics, allowed these abuses to infiltrate our communities for too long. I wanted to share this image. It's a rendition of the Disney story of Pocahontas, but it creates a much more accurate depiction of the story compared to the romanticized and inaccurate version that Disney told. And with that, I will turn our slides over to Cassie to talk a little bit more about some more dynamics of sexual assault.
So we're going to change gears and go to the basics of what sexual assault is. So sexual assault can be defined as sexual contact or behavior that occurs without the explicit consent of the victim. It can be used as an umbrella term to identify all of the actions below. With that being said, consent can be defined as an agreement or permission expressed through affirmative voluntary words or actions that are mutually understandable to all parties involved to engage in a specific sexual act at a specific time. Consent can be withdrawn at any time as long as it is clearly communicated.
We're going to talk a little bit about the intersectionality of MMIW and sexual assault. Native community members, especially youth, are often targeted by human traffickers to be lured away from their communities by the promise of a better life. Trafficking is one of the many reasons that we have such high rates of missing and murdered Indigenous women. When our community members are lured away, however, the life that they are promised is not a better one, but it is often, in fact, a life full of sexual exploitation and further abuse. One of the reasons that Native people are targeted by traffickers is because they can be, quote, marketed to potential sex buyers, because many Native people have the appearance of being racially ambiguous. So traffickers are also aware of many of the complicated jurisdictional issues that would allow them to evade prosecution and hide on reservations. These dynamics make it easier for both traffickers and buyers to cross international borders with their victims, making the location of some of these missing and murdered Indigenous women even harder to identify once they are out of our communities for that long. The intersections of sexual assault and domestic violence might look like a partner making their victim feel like they own them. A perpetrator might provide drugs and alcohol to their partner to, quote, loosen up their inhibitions. Perpetrators play on the fact that they're in a relationship and might say things such as, sex is the only way to prove that you love me. Or they might say, if I don't get sex from you, I'll get it somewhere else. A perpetrator of sexual abuse in an intimate partner relationship might react negatively if their victim says no, or they might intimidate them until they agree to do something. A perpetrator might also continue to pressure their victim even after they say no, by using threats or fear of what might happen if they do say no. Additionally, perpetrators might try to normalize their sexual expectations when in fact they are very harmful.
So to continue on with the intersection of sexual assault and domestic abuse, between 40% and 45% of women in abusive relationships are sexually assaulted during the course of that relationship. Victims who are both physically and sexually abused are more likely to be injured or killed than victims who experience one form of abuse. Over half of women raped by an intimate partner were sexually assaulted multiple times by the same partner, and any history of sexual assaults against the mother should be treated as a warning sign of possible sexual or physical abuse of the children. So, warning signs in children. It's not always easy to spot sexual abuse because perpetrators often take steps to hide those actions. Some signs are easier to spot than others. For instance, some warning signs might be noticed by a caretaker or their parent and are often red flags that the child needs medical attention. Listen to your instincts. If you notice something that isn't right or someone in a child's life is making you uncomfortable, even if you can't put your finger on why, it's important to trust your gut, continue to watch for signs of abuse, and talk to the child who may be experiencing abuse in age-appropriate ways. So with that, some physical signs might be an STI or sexually transmitted infections, signs of trauma, and then behavioral signs can include excessive talk about or knowledge of sexual topics, keeping secrets or not talking as much as usual, not wanting to be left alone with certain people, or being afraid to be away from primary caregivers, especially if this is a new behavior. Regressive behaviors or resuming behaviors they had grown out of, such as thumb sucking or bedwetting, overly compliant behavior, sexual behavior that is inappropriate for the child's age, or trying to avoid removing clothing to change or bathe. Some emotional signs might include change in eating habits, change change in mood or personality, such as increased aggression, decrease in confidence or self-image, or excessive worry or fearfulness. This list may seem overwhelming to keep in mind when looking out for a child in your life, and some signs seem to contradict each other, such as being overly compliant or oppositional, or showing regressive behaviors or advanced sexual behaviors. The most important thing to keep in mind when looking for signs of child sexual abuse is to keep an eye on sudden changes in behavior. Trust your gut and don't ignore feelings if something seems off. If a child tells you that someone makes them uncomfortable, even if they can't tell you anything specific, just listen. So grooming. Grooming can be defined as manipulative behaviors that the abuser uses to gain access to a potential victim, force them to agree to the abuse, and reduce the risk of being caught. While these tactics are most often used against younger kids, teens, and vulnerable adults are also at risk. Keeping children safe can be challenging because many perpetrators who abuse children are in positions of trust. 93% of child sexual assault victims know their perpetrator. This includes family members, members of faith communities, coaches, teachers, and other helping professionals. Grooming can take place either online or in person. So, predatory warning signs. It's important to be cautious of an adult who spends time with children and exhibits the following behaviors. So, they do not respect boundaries or listen when someone tells them no, engages in touching that a child or child's parents, guardians have indicated is unwanted, tries to be a child's friend rather than filling an adult role in the child's life, does not seem to have age-appropriate relationships, talks with children about their personal problems or relationships, spends time alone with children outside of their role in the child's life, or makes up excuses to be alone with the child, expresses unusual interest in child's sexual development, such as commenting on sexual characteristics or sexualizing normal behaviors, gives a child gifts without occasion or reason, spends a lot of time with your child or another child you know, or restricts a child's access to other adults. It's not always easy to identify child sexual abuse, and it can be even more challenging to step in if you suspect something isn't right. Keeping a child away from the perpetrator may mean major changes in your own life, even if you are outside of the child's family. If something seems off, pay attention to that feeling and look into it further. If a child tells you that someone makes them uncomfortable, even if they can't tell you anything specific, again, just listen.
Thanks, Cassie. And then finally, we wanted to discuss just a little bit more about why this is such an important topic and why we should be invested in caring about sexual assault in our communities. And while this can be very difficult to hear, the more awareness brought to the topic, the better we can do as a community to prevent further harm. I wanted to share this image, which comes from the White Bison Wellbriety movement. As you can see in the first picture, that historical trauma has created unhealthy roots full of anger, guilt, shame, and fear. From those unhealthy roots have grown high rates of adversities such as MMIW, mental health struggles, substance abuse, sexual abuse, domestic violence, and more. When we learn about and address these difficult topics, we can heal as a community and create healthy roots, such as are depicted on the right-hand side. Healthy roots such as healing, unity, hope, forgiveness, traditions and culture and spirituality. Those healthy roots can build resiliency in our communities and allow our children to thrive for the next 7 generations. And finally, I wanted to share that if you or someone you know has been impacted by sexual assault, please call the Oneida Domestic Abuse and Prevention Program. We have adult and youth advocates that can help to respond to those dynamics and answer any questions that you might have. So finally, Yawanko, thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to you joining us at our next presentation from the Oneida Domestic Abuse and Prevention Program.